Three, two, one. Welcome to the Lightforge. This is Adwukta.
This is Merps. We are, in the beginning slash mid of June. Hopefully the weather is turning out nicely for you guys, except I guess it's winter in the other side of the world, right? Like in
Yes,
Australia or
like the
something.
bottom side of the world.
Right. The bottom side of the world. Anyways, for those of you in the US and also in EU, hopefully the weather is turning nice, so you can really enjoy that weather by staying indoors and playing Hearthstone
Or you can
Arena.
play Hearthstone outside if you have a cell phone or like a tablet or something.
Oh, the glare. It's so
Yeah,
bad.
you can find a shady area.
And people might disturb you and like mess up your turn.
Oh, you don't live in New
Uh,
York. No one disturbs you in New York. They just leave you alone.
yeah, but you know how you really prevent people from disturbing you? By
By
going
not
into
being
your
outside.
own place and locking your door.
Keeping the
Yeah,
door locked. Okay,
yeah.
so that's the theme for today. Stay inside, keep the door locked, play more Hearthstone. I was just telling Merps this earlier. I'm going to be devoting the entire rest of the month to just pure Hearthstone stuff. In my life.
Well, you have to. You need to get those runs in.
I
Yeah.
do. Even if I'm not going for the leaderboard, which is a little iffy now because I had a rough start. So we'll see if we can get enough runs in there to actually make it worth it. But still, that's the rest of my month, and I would like some company if anyone wants to join me
By
in
the
a
way,
Hearthstone binge.
so for those of you just listening, I will tell you, Adulta has moved in, and I don't think those boxes have moved at
Oh,
all.
they totally moved. There's one less box there. I don't know if you guys can tell.
I can't really tell.
Okay, there's one less box there than the last time I was streaming.
All right. So is this the rate that we should expect one box a week?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That would be that'll take us to the next expansion. I think that's fair.
How many boxes are not shown in your field of vision right now?
1, 2.
Okay. I was expecting like 20 other boxes.
Hold on. None of the boxes. Oh my god, all my boxes are being shown right now if you're watching this on YouTube.
Wow.
Like if I lean back and you see that box over there, that's all the boxes. I have no other boxes.
Okay. I was expecting like it would have been funny if it was like 20 more boxes. So by the
just
time
like
you
I'll feel like I
unpack-
turn the camera and
Right,
you just see the boxes on the other side of the room too.
And also, like, you keep on going at this rate, one box every single week, and then by the time you've unpacked, that's time to like possibly look for a new apartment.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a lot of boxes. All right. Well, instead of talking about my lack of unpacking the boxes, let's talk about Hearthstone. What's going on with Hearthstone? Is anything happening with Hearthstone? We have like another month, maybe month and a half left before the next expansion even starts getting teased.
Right.
What's
Not when
on?
the next expansion comes out. It's
Yeah.
like when they release like the random vague image.
When Abed comes on and tells you that the expansion is coming.
Right. Well, dude, I mean, the videos with like the Angoro stuff with like Abed, right? That even came like a couple of weeks after they first teased it. So look, maybe in a month we'll be expecting like the official Twitter to like post this like random sort of blurry picture of like Dalaran, right? And then
It's gonna be Dalaran. So you know who's
People
gonna
are
be really good in Dalaran?
Dalaran Mage.
Mages. Oh wow, because that's a class that needs a buff. But to be fair, Mage is probably not the best class right now. We're about to do a Mage run after this. So we're a little focused on the Mage right now.
Look, I mean, that's kind of disingenuous. Like, even if you say, "Oh, Mage might not be the best class," it's like, all right, well,
It's still really freaking close.
Then it's top 2 at least, right?
Well, I find it hard to imagine that Dalaran will come out in an expansion and mages will not be really good, you know? It's like when Karazhan was coming out, I heard the name and I was like, so mages are going to be overpowered. And then mages became overpowered with Firelands Portal on top of the summoning guy that is all banned in Arena right now. Which was technically OG, but it was a big like power creep and it stayed on, right? For the Karazhan meta before they took it away.
There's Firelands Portal. It also came out with Babbling Book.
Oh, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, right?
I remember this.
Oh, God. Yeah, people were not so happy during that time. But anyways, look, this is too early for speculation. This is basically the time in the meta in which we go through every single time. It's just like, oh, man, look, the honeymoon period of Un'Goro was over a month
while
ago,
ago.
right?
It was over a while ago, yeah.
This is the slog, and it happens every single cycle. Well, not every. Some cycles are shorter than others.
This is gonna be a
but
long cycle.
you always get into a slog at some point, and we are in this slog of Un'Goro. This is where we are in the tar,
And
right?
yeah, and you know what? I love the tar. Like, I know people like we paint it in such like a negative kind of light, but this is like my favorite time of the meta. Like every meta when it comes to the end, but before the very end. Like I hate the last 2 weeks. Like once the expansion gets announced, the meta kind of goes to shit, I think. Because once the expansion like gets announced and you start seeing new cards, then people don't play the arena anymore, except like people who are like me. And then I'm just only playing people like me, which are like terribly hardcore people. And it gets like really bogged down. But this is the part of the meta before the announcement, but after the honeymoon period, what I like to call the normal part of the meta. Like this is Un'Goro. This is the arena meta right now. And you can really focus and like improve your game here better than anywhere else because it's not moving, right? It's in the tar. You get a lot of time, especially if you're someone who like, you know, can't play like 5 runs a day. You can really figure out the meta in a way that it won't change on you until like 2 months from now.
Yeah. So look, this is the time when you are really able to hone your skills, right? And you also just have kind of no excuse. You can't say, oh, it's because of the meta's changing,
or these crazy new cards I don't know yet.
Right, or like there's too many noobs. There's not enough noobs. There's
the right amount of noobs right now.
Sure.
This
well,
is the
I don't know about
Goldilocks
right
of
amount,
the,
but there's a consistent amount of players, and that and the quality of players shouldn't really change anymore.
Okay.
It's just
So this is where we are in the meta. We talked about Hunter and going aggressive last time in Deep Fried Meta. So today for Deep Fried Meta, where we deep fried the meta, we're going to talk to you about something that confuses the crap out of like half of our viewers whenever we do it. And actually, I want to say like most other streamers probably do it more than we do because we're very like tempo focused. And so we don't talk about this. We've like never talked about this topic because it doesn't fit as into our playstyle as I think it fits into most people's playstyles. So if you're mostly watching our streams or listening to us, you may not think this is like the biggest part of the meta. It's not the biggest part, but it's gotten more prominent in 7.1 and then on Goro with the threat and response meta. And that is the concept of holding your cards, of doing nothing when you can do something. So we're going to try to pick out the instances and explain to you that this does not happen very often. If you find yourself doing this more than like once or twice in a game, even if you're doing it like on average twice in a game, you're way too high, right? But this is something that it's a tool in an advanced player's toolbox. And if you are a less advanced player, like if you're averaging 3 wins and you find yourself using this a lot, then you're doing it wrong. Just like ignore this whole thing if you don't at least average like 4 wins per run. Like know what it is, but like try to make yourself not use it as much as possible. It's a pretty advanced concept because the idea is in this turn, even though I can do something, like the most normal example that I can give is play a River Croc. It's late game. Play a River Croc. And instead, I choose to do nothing and pass my turn. So that's the kind of situation that you will see people do, and I want to explain where that's coming from, when that's right, and when you should work that into your game. Because it's exactly the opposite of what you usually do, right? You usually just tempo out, right? So, you wanna kick us off with the
sure.
Yeah.
So the first example of sort of when you want to hold, right? So first of all, I think we should define by holding, do we just mean like literally holding on to a more tempo-oriented card, or sometimes just like playing slower, right?
Yeah.
Because there's sort of a difference there.
Yeah.
Like, and if we're encompassing both, I guess we can just talk about both at the same time.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about stuff where you like detempo for a very specific reason. Like sometimes you play a 3-6 if the board has 2 3-3s on your opponent's side, you play a 3-6 instead of a 4-6 because you're like, I just need to kill the 2 3-3s. I don't need this extra one, and the 3-6 may draw a card or something. It's a bad example because there's no 3-6s that draw a card, but you get the idea, right? Like if let's say 2 2-2s on the board, you can play a Senjin or you can play a Senjin's a bad example. I'm running out of good examples. Okay, you can play a Gnomish Inventor or somehow like another 2-4, and the Gnomish Inventor draws a card. Or sorry, like a 3-4. Or like a 4-4. I'm not putting very good examples out there. Okay, let's say you could play a generic 4-mana 4/4 or a Gnomish Eventer for 2/4, and there's two 4/4s on the board, and we're not on curve, right? In that case, usually you try to draw the card and play the 2/4, right? It's anti-tempo because 4/4 is better than 2/4, but your opponent could just run his 2/2/2s into your like either 2/4 or 4/4 anyway, so that 4 attack is probably not going to make a difference because your opponent gets to pick, right? So
Sure.
in the instances in which it would have made a difference, like your opponent's about to drop a 7/4, he would make the trade. And therefore you don't get the benefit of the attack. And in the cases where your opponent's going to play a normal minion, like a 5/5 or something, he will not make the trade. And then you will not get the benefit anyway because his card still eats your card. So it's a very like bad situation for your 4/4, which is why you would detempo in that situation. I don't want to talk too much about that because that's like just like almost pure like board states, right? And,
Right.
And it gets into a different concept of up-tempoing or detempoing. But when it comes to holding, there's one other thing that I want to like separate this out right out of the gate. I want to separate this out into like kind of a separate category. But when I say holding, I include like anything that does not give you tempo. So as long as you're not removing something from your opponent's board or putting something on the board or buffing something on your board, then I think you're basically you're not affecting the tempo on the board. So that doesn't mean you can't do other things, right? You can draw cards. That's the most obvious way to like basically quote unquote like skip a turn, right? You play sprint, you skip a turn. You have played a card, but it has not affected the tempo at all. And there are other times where playing sprint can actually affect the tempo. Like if you have some eviscerates in your deck is the most obvious example, and you play a sprint with 9 or 10 mana, right? And then you eviscerate afterwards, so you got some tempo out of it.
Sure.
But yeah, you separate those out because those are pretty much just skipping a turn. It has the same effect, right? Sometimes you heal yourself when you're not like about to die or anything like that. But you will do those in the same situations generally as you would do the rest of the things.
Gotcha. So what about this scenario? Would it be in this category? Like, let's say, and I don't know how often it'll happen, but the person has like 2 Magma Ragers on their end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like your turn 4 and you just decide to ping instead of putting out like a card, right? That's also gaining more resources.
Yes. So that's also a situation where you gain other resources by holding. So you're not playing a card to gain resources. You are using your hero power, and your hero power is like an endless way to get card advantage for most classes that are not the warrior. And it doesn't matter if you're putting a 1/1 on the board or pinging something or like literally drawing a card or healing something on the board. If you're using your hero power, you're getting more cards, and it's the equivalent of kind of like playing a card that draws you cards.
Okay, so I guess one time to hold is like to gain other resources, and like you said, because what you put out there, or by putting something out there, you don't really gain as much, right? Yeah. It's sort of an evaluation of like, what do I gain from putting this out versus what I can draw, and how much do I need to actually win the game? It's sort of like that balance and that calculation.
Yep, and I don't want to focus too much on that. That's why I'm trying to like set it aside, because that's usually an example of detempo. Like you want to do these things when you would prefer to not play anything at all anyway. Like that's when you really want to play these things. If there is a case in which you're fighting for the board and you're playing something in which detempos you, right? Even if your opponent has like a 2/1 on the board that they played for 1 mana and you can hero power it down as a mage, you're detempoing yourself by 1 mana. Because you spent 1 mana, you're going to spend 2. Is it good to ping? Yeah, it's good to ping, but you're detempoing. So the ideal situation is to do all of these. Not that these are the only situations you do it in, especially if you're only detempoing by like 1 mana. But if you want to like hold a turn, like 6 mana, 7 mana, 8 mana, you want that to be a turn in which you were not going to want to play anything anyway. Like, you want to... Like, the turns you play the Arcane Intellects and the Sprints and whatever, you want those to be the turns in which, I would not want to put stuff out on the board for whatever reason. Or I would not want to remove his stuff for whatever reason. Or turns in which I could play a 5-mana card that gives me 2 tempo. I don't know. For like, you could play like a Demented Frostcaller or something. Right? Not a Demented Frostcaller. What's the one am I thinking of? Evolve Kobold. You could play a Polluted Kobold? The 4-mana 2/2 that gives +2 spell damage?
It's
Evolve Kobold, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can play an Evolve Kobold, or you can play a 1-mana 2/2 and an Arcane Intellect, right? You have the same tempo on the board, and you just purely draw a card. That's when you want to play those cards, to the extent possible. Or like
Right.
you're really far up on the board, you're afraid of a flame strike for some reason because you have a read, or I don't know, somehow you know your opponent has a board clear, and so you don't want to play more into that board, and so then you use your card draws. But those are the same situations in which you would normally want to not play any cards at all in the first place. So I don't want people to think of it too much as, oh, I'm trading off. Like, look, I may not have gotten the tempo, but I got a whole bunch of cards. That's not very important. You will lose if you keep making these trades against tempo. So I don't want
Sure.
people to think that, oh, one of the good reasons to hold is because I'm getting other resources. You always get other resources when you sprint or when you like Arcane Intellect or you play a greater healing potion on your face. You always get more other resources. But that's not a
Yeah.
good reason to use those cards on those turns.
You know, if I'm a listener, sort of, tuning into your advice right now, I think one question I would have is sort of the examples that we've listed are quite, I guess, obvious, right? It's like, oh, do I just put down a 2/2 with like my 6 mana, or do I, like Arcane Intellect, right? Like, right, like Arcane Intellect, and I think a lot of listeners would be like, well, it's those sort of in between things that I'm like.
Yeah, so I think I'm pointing out that specific
Yeah.
example because you don't want to Arcane Intellect in other turns. Like
Sure.
that's the line in which you want to Arcane Intellect, is when you're losing like one tempo or no tempo at all. Usually no tempo at all. Maybe one tempo later on in the game. Like those are the turns you want to Arcane Intellect. You don't want to be like, oh, Arcane Intellect gets me 2 cards that's worth like 3 mana, so I will play it because it uses up all my mana. If another way, like maybe doesn't use up all your mana, maybe use 5 instead of 6 mana, but you get like a 5/6 on the board, and the Arcane Intellect maybe uses all 6 mana, but instead it gets to like a 3/3 on the board. Like a 5/6 and a 3/3 is a huge difference, even though you missed 1 mana the other way, right? You still tempo the other way, and it's a huge tempo difference. So that's what I mean by like your presumption of when to play the cards to gain resources, or when to what I basically call hold a turn or like skip a turn, is the bar has to be very, very high. Like we haven't even started talking about when you want to actually skip a turn yet. I'm just like separating out the times in which you're doing other stuff. You're not really skipping your turn, but you're doing other stuff in a way that puts you back on tempo. And I'm basically trying to say, don't do it. Right? I want to start this discussion off about when to skip a turn and say, like, don't skip a turn. Even if you get other stuff to it, don't skip a turn. Instead, save those cards for the situations that are coming up when you would want to hold a turn anyway. Because using your mana is better than not using your mana. So when you don't need that tempo, when you're purposefully, you would rather not play a card and just like let the mana sit, as compared to like use up the mana, that's when you want to use the mana that don't affect the tempo, right? That's when you want to Arcane Intellect.
Sure. Yeah, I think we've established a baseline for the first prong, which is you want to hold cards in order to gain other resources, right? And then I guess past that, do you want to move on to the second prong?
Yeah. So what are these? The next part is just what are these turns? They're not prongs. I don't like to think of them as prongs. These are just like topics. It's not like a thought process, right? You're never like entering a turn being like, do I do nothing this turn? That's it comes up, right?
Notice you eventually... that was not on my checklist. Okay. Yeah.
That should not be on anyone's checklist.
Or while it could happen, that's never how you should structure it.
Yeah.
Like you never ask that question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Instead, what happens is your turn, you look at it and you have nothing good to do in a turn, or you're afraid to do so many things in a turn. And then you think, okay, because my turn sucks so much, maybe I just shouldn't do anything, or because it gets so heavily punished, maybe I just don't do anything. And the biggest reason for that most people think of right away is a board clear, right? Like I'm on the board. My opponent, it used to be Flame Strike. Now no one's really afraid of Flame Strikes because they're not anywhere. But like, maybe like
Dragonfire Potion.
Yeah, maybe a Dragonfire Potion. Volcanoes are a big one. 2 damage to everything is a huge one, right? Like let's say you only have 2 3/2s on that you can play, right? Your turn was going to be 3/2 3/2 hero power. That's all you can play. All your other cards are 7 mana or whatever, and you have 6 mana. And you have 2 things already with 2 health on the board. Do you really want to play all those into it? Like you haven't tested for this card or whatever, or it's just about to be turn 8 and a Primordial Drake would totally ruin you, and you have the board anyway. Like, do you really want to go all in on that? So that's usually a turn in which you could hold your cards, and sometimes you want to hedge it a little, right? You're like, well, how much will Volcanic Potion say screw me if I currently just have a 3/2 on the board? Well, he's not going to play a Volcanic Potion just to clear a 3-2 usually. So I could give him another 3-2. And then he plays a Volcanic Potion, and it's like fine, basically, right? Like he gets his value because he had the card, but it's fine. On the other hand, if I play 2 3-2s in, then I'm kind of all in because he's going to remove 3 of my cards with one of his cards if he has it. And on the other hand, if I just hold my turn, I just have a 3-2 on the board, I'm passing into his turn 7, he's going to get the board completely at that point. Right, you just expect him to get the board. And then I have to look, well, what else is in my hand? Can I reasonably take back the board if I'm going to take that chance? So usually you kind of hedge in that situation. You give him a little bit of value for his maybe board clear. But you don't want to give him too much value unless you don't win otherwise. Right? Like sometimes if he has a Primordial Drake, like if you're already tested for the fact that he has no board clears, and then it just becomes turn 8, and you're like, well, Primordial Drake's a card, everyone takes that card, plus he can top deck a bunch of cards. Do I just not play into this 2 damage all removal? And you think to yourself, well, what happens if I don't play into it? And then he actually, like, you know, what happens if I don't play into it and he actually has a Primordial Drake? Do I win? Maybe you don't win anyway, right? Maybe you're a hunter, you don't have him down to low enough health, so if he Primordial Drakes, you can't hero power him down, he has a huge taunt, you can't remove it, and you lose anyway. In that case, yeah, you just play into it. But otherwise, maybe you hold back a little.
Right. So I guess to add, some of you guys might be wondering, it's like, well, where does this fit in, right? Because we were basically saying, like, notice how this isn't in the checklist. So where is it exactly in the checklist? It's basically near the quote end because it requires synthesis of information, right? Like you've just heard Adwick to say, you have to sort of, you needed to already ask the questions like, well, what reads do I have, right? And also it's like, how punishing is this? How punishing is that? And then sort of look at the options in your hand. So like this sort of decision of when to hold and when to play stuff, it really just is in that phase where you say, okay, here are my options. And then it just helps you weigh what is good versus what is bad. And part of the reason why we're talking about this is like some people don't really think of not doing stuff as a great option, right? Like some people
because it's not.
I mean, it's like when before humanity discovered zero, right? It just like, and then they discover zero, and it just like blew everyone's mind. It's like, wow, nothing. It's crazy. And I'm not saying like it's, you know, as big as that. I don't want to overblow it. I don't want to oversell this. But it is something that I think people don't give enough thought to. And then they just try to, because of the ideas that have been hammered into their head, right? Like use your mana, tempo, board initiative. These are all great things, which they are.
Yep.
Until they're not.
And yeah, until they're not. So generally, I'd say the rule is still tempo out, but like definitely tempo out if you can't win the game otherwise. But also generally tempo out unless you're afraid of a specific thing that you like have a read on or that will ruin your game when you're in a very dominant position already. So if you're in a dominant position, you probably don't need to be like overly dominant in order to win the game, and you'll get a feel of how dominant you need to be against which classes as it breaks down, like as you get more experience with it, to know when like you're potentially over tempoing. And there's nothing wrong with over tempoing. You just expose yourself more to if they have a card, right? Like I always over tempo when I have a read because I trust my reads. So if I have a read that they don't have something, I will go all into it because otherwise you're just holding yourself back. I never play around the top deck anything. Like the chances are just too low and it's usually not worth it. But there are definitely situations in which you don't want to go in there because you don't have a read, right? You could have something that deals 2 damage to everything. I haven't given him a good chance to use it, or the last time I gave him a good chance to use it was like 4 cards ago and he hasn't played 3 of those cards, right? So like you could easily have drawn it. That's not just 1 top deck now. Now that's like 4 top decks, right? So you've just drastically increased your odds of getting screwed.
Yep.
So that's something to kind of watch out for. But that's still not terribly advanced, right? The real advanced times in which you do not want to play anything. And this is what I think is a pretty like difficult line for people to draw and realize. Because normally, like we said, right, you just tempo. But what happens if your opponent, there's 2 situations that I'm going to kind of like outline, right? One is your opponent has a 6/6 on the board. You have a 3/5 in your hand that you can play or not play. Your other card is an Arcane Intellect. You've used it, you got nothing. And now you have a 3/5 in your hand, and you can play it or not play it. And the other situation we're going to talk about later is your opponent has nothing on the board but one card in his hand. You have you have two cards in your hand. One of them's a River Croc. You finish your turn by clearing off your opponent's board. You have 2 more mana. You play the River Croc.
All right, how about we just go with one situation at a time? As the this is already two. I'm like, I have to remember 2 situations. Let's just go with one situation. So what's situation number 1?
I just said situation number 1. Situation number 1 is when your opponent has a 6/6 and you have a 3/5 in your hand. Your turn is otherwise done. You can either play the card or not play the card.
Right.
You have no other choices.
Right.
Well, you
so
can
let's
hero
keep
power,
the River
right?
Croc thing
You can
out
hero
of it.
power.
Okay. Right. So no River Croc shenanigans yet, right?
No, that's scenario number 2.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm just asking. Let's not introduce both scenarios yet.
Okay, I just want to give a roadmap of people of where this is leading to, right?
Okay.
Like, I don't want people to think of this as an isolated scenario where my opponent has a 6/6 and I have this weird hand in which I can play a 3/5 or nothing. I want people to think about this holistically in the sense of these situations pop up in many different ways. There's sometimes when your opponent has a board and you're going to play into his, like, you're basically feeding his minion, right? He wants you to play a 3/5. That's a great trade for him. You just spent a card and you only dealt probably a 4-cost card, and you have only dealt 3 damage to his huge minion that could take 3 damage without blinking. Right? No, that's really good for him. And on the other hand, the other scenario is the River Croc scenario where you don't know what he's going to do, but you're pretty sure that anything he does will screw the minion you have on the board. So the other scenario is about whether you need the initiative. And this is like the world of times in which you may want to do nothing, absolutely nothing.
Yes. So I think these examples are fantastic. I think especially the first example is so good because it happens in games very, very often, right? Now, so I think the way that you want to break it down is, so they have a 6/6, you have a 3/5, and a card draw, an Arcane Intellect, or just something similar, right? Something very similar, maybe like a Thought Steal if you're another class. What you want to think about in these situations is sort of how much number 1 can you use your health as a resource, right? That is a big consideration because 6 to your face is pretty big. Yep. It definitely increases the pressure on you. And you have to be confident that you can use your health as a resource, and that you need the. So all right, after that, number 2 is how much do I need the 3/5 later on, right? If you are confident that you can just toss a card out there and say, okay, am I comfortable with this 4-mana Aberrant Berserker, right? Am I comfortable with this Aberrant Berserker just being a Holding Light, right? Because I can play the card and I'll take a Holding Light here because I can win the control game. Then that is also a time in which you just play it. And then the Arcane Intellect, I think that is very important because now you want to think about your outs, right? Let's say you're in a bad spot, and if they've already got a 6/6 out there and you don't have, you only have the 3/5 and the Arcane Intellect, you're not in a good spot. So at this point, you want to start thinking about okay, well, do I have any board clears, right? And then if I have board clears, or maybe do I have a big removal? If I only have big removals left in my deck, maybe I Arcane Intellect, and the next turn I'm trying to Hex or Polymorph that big thing and then play out, right? And this is sort of
okay. So you're still saying you could play that or the Arcane. I'm saying you already play the Arcane Intellect in the scenario.
Oh, okay.
So I can tell you're very confused by even just the first scenario.
Yeah, dude, I'm confused.
My situation is just whether it's not like a choice. If given a choice, it's much more likely you play the Arcane Intellect rather than feeding, right? Especially if you can get outs and things like that. What I'm saying is,
I was about to say, if you need the HP, and then let's say on the next turn, what you can do, for example, is you can play the 3/5 this turn, and on the next turn, let's say you have a Flame Strike in there, right? You get a draw, and then you can Arcane Intellect, and then also draw into the Flame Strike, and then Flame Strike. Maybe that's how you want to try to win, right? In those scenarios, but that's not even the scenario we're talking about.
Okay, and that wouldn't work because the amount of mana that you have would have to be 10 to Arcane Intellect into it.
Oh, sure, yeah. Arcane Intellect and Flame Strike, it still works,
Yeah, okay, but it would have to be okay. So what I'm talking about here is you do nothing or you do something. right? It's very clear cut. You've already used your Arcane Intellect or pinged or do whatever. You have your only choice right now. You're not making trade-offs right now, right? Because you're still talking about trade-offs. And that's what we set aside in the very beginning, right? When we're talking about gaining other resources. Like, you've brought this conversation back to whether I want to gain other resources. Or I want to play this minion. I want to take that out of the. That's exactly why we started this off with Arcane Intellect, because I want to set that aside. Because you're talking about a whole different set of considerations, actually much more complicated.
Well, it's because I didn't understand your thing. I thought we had the Arcane Intellect, man.
We already used the Arcane Intellect. That's why he had 6 mana and we have 7. That's why he's playing a 6/6 and we're using an Arcane Intellect and potentially playing a 3/5, right?
Okay.
Like, that's how the game would actually play out.
Okay, so lead us down the correct path, man. Lead us down to the
So we're setting
right
aside that there's no other resources to be gained. You're doing something or you're doing nothing. That's the scenario. If you're gaining other resources potentially, you have many different considerations, and we've gone over that, right? We've gone over whether there's sometimes in which you're just in desperate need of cards or whatever, right? I just need this hard removal, and if I don't get it, I'm going to lose, so I might as well as Arcane Intellect for it, rather than like stall the game until I lose. But here, getting back to the actual example here, right? Which is, your opponent has a 6/6, you have a 3/5 or you have nothing. Do you want nothing or do you want a 3/5 on the board? So the first consideration is your health, right? Because let's think about exactly what happens when you put a 3/5 on the board or if you don't. If you put a 3/5 on the board, you will, assuming you're not about to die and take lethal the next turn, you are dealing 3 damage to your opponent's 6/6, and you are healing yourself for 6 health. That's what happens. That's what that 3/5 is turned. You have spent 4 mana, lost the card, dealt 3 damage to the minion on the board, and gained 6 health. It's not the most awful thing in the world. So now what you have to think is, do I want to do that? Or is that 3/5 on the board at a later turn going to give me a higher chance to win the game, even if I take the 6 damage now? That's the question that you want to ask. So why might you want to deal the 3 So first of all, why might you want to save the 6 health? You might want to save the 6 health because you're like getting close to dying, and maybe if you deal 6 damage now, it doesn't matter what you do to set up the next turn, he'll just go face and you'll lose, right? Like, if that's the case, yeah, you just want to throw cards at him because otherwise you lose. You're just preventing yourself from losing. Now, why might you want to deal the 3 damage? Because remember, that 4 mana card now has 2 effects. You might want to deal 3 damage because your next card that you're going to play does not deal 6 damage to your opponent, right? So this 3 damage may only deal 3 damage now, but it's useful. Because maybe the next card you're going to play is the 3/8 Taunt. So if he doesn't remove it, well, now your 3 damage dealt to his guy was actually pretty useful. Should it have cost 4 mana? Probably not, but you also gained some health from it. And if you didn't do it, you've just lost that 3 damage, and he's going to keep getting the board, which is really bad. So the second reason is usually why we say just keep tempoing out, right? Because if he has a 6/6, you need to chip down on it. So the times in which you actually want to do nothing are the times in which you have enough of a health pool that you can take the hit and not be in like a really like bad situation where you can't like just drop minions on the board and he'll go face and you lose. And, not or, but and. That has to be true. And what also has to be true is you do not already have a way of dealing with the 6/6 on the next turn without, like, so the situation in which that 3 damage on the 6/6 would actually matter. So if you have a hard removal, or you have an 8/8 in your hand, or you have a Bog Creeper in your hand that you're about to play the next turn, then maybe you don't play it. So the scenario in which you do nothing rather than something is, one, you can afford to take the health hit, plus, in addition to being able to take the health hit, you must have a way to deal with what is already on the board in a way in which that 3 damage doesn't help at all. And those ways are hard removal or a giant card.
Yep.
Now,
and sometimes it involves looking at your out as well, right? But that
right, okay. So yeah, sometimes if you're so desperate, you may be like, well, I just have to magically draw this card the next turn or I lose. Because it's true, right? If you do need the card advantage from the 3/5 eventually to finish off the game, then you may just be like, well, my next card has to be a Bog Creeper. If it's not, I lose. And if it is a Bog Creeper, then this 3/5 does nothing. And so therefore, playing the 3/5 doesn't do anything. On the other hand, if I had a Bog Creeper, I still need the card advantage from the 3/5 later on to be able to win.
Yeah. No, and this is something that I, you can categorize as under sort of turn planning, right? But I definitely have seen this throughout like my coaching sessions and whatnot. Some people don't think about resolving the issue, right? And this is really about sort of like resolving the issue. It's like when you ask the question, do I have an independent way to deal with the current problem, or do I need to pair up like this 3/5 with another quote answer, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of people, they look at the next turn by just sort of seeing as like, oh, what can I play? They don't really look at it in terms of like adding together two small answers to this potential issue, or like, no, I don't want two when I can just answer with one, something like that.
Yep. So that's the easier example, right? Of when do you feed your opponent's minion.
Yep.
The harder example is when do you put something out on the board that you're pretty sure is like a weak thing, and whatever your opponent puts out next will be able to eat it. And in today's meta, 2/3s are like the worst example of that. Also even like 3/3s for 3 mana, those are also not that good. They're at least better than 2/3s, but they're probably not going to eat whatever your opponent puts out. Like your opponent is probably, you're just putting 3 tempo on the board. So it's turn 10. You've just cleared the board, let's say with a Flame Strike or something, and you have some mana left over, and you can do nothing, or you can play a 2/3. So one of the and if you play a 2/3, think about what your opponent has. Almost anything your opponent puts out is going to eat the 2/3. So here, you're seeding the 2/3 to get 2 damage of tempo the next turn. Right? Because your opponent presumably plays something, you have to throw the 2/3 in. But your opponent gets to decide what to put out, right? So if your opponent has like a whole bunch of 1/1s or something, right? Like summon the finishers or whatever. He's not going to play that. He's going to play like call in the finishers. He's going to play in the other cards. So you are giving your opponent, you're basically removing any chance that your River Croc is actually going to be good, right? If you play a River Croc onto an empty board in the late game, there's no chance that River Croc is good. There is a near certain chance that the River Croc will deal 2 damage to something of your opponent's choosing. Half, because he has to decide what to put down, and then you get to decide which one to deal that 2 damage to. Assuming you don't need to pressure your opponent's face, and then that 2 damage isn't like the difference between you dealing lethal or not, you will only do that if you value the 2/3 as just 2 damage on the board. And then it's just free damage. If you somehow value it more for some reason, then you would hold it. So in the case of a Croc, you almost never hold it because it never gets value, right? Like you're in the late game, what's it going to do? What's like the best case scenario for this Croc? But other times, let's say you're holding a Galaka Crawler, well now you may potentially have something. Like what are you really losing if you play it after your opponent plays something, right? You gain the chance that he plays Call on the Finishers or some other card like that, like a 2/2 or whatever, that your Croc actually matches up pretty well against. Like, you lose that chance, however slim. And you also lose the chance that they play a Pirate. So now you gotta think about it a little more, about whether you play it or not. And then the extreme situations, like if you have like a Acidic Swamp Ooze, for example, and your opponent, is a weapons class. Well then, you may be like, well, there's a pretty big swing if I hold on to it. Maybe I don't want to play it. So those are the things you're thinking of. Again, usually the scenario is you just tempo it out because your card probably doesn't really do anything, or whatever it does is not terribly big enough. Like in the case of a Galaka Crawler, you just play it, right? Like you're not like saying like, oh, let's wait for the Pirate. You just play it for the 2 damage the next turn. Probably in today's meta, I would say the biggest issue this comes in is whether you play a 4/3 or not. Because a 4/3 is easily countered. If we're in a stall game in which we both have 30 health, and that 4 damage to the face isn't going to matter too much, and we each have like 2 cards in our hands, and my opponent is just playing for card advantage, he will be able to very, very efficiently match up with your 4/3. Assuming you don't have like a good way to remove a small thing. He'll play a 3/3, he'll play a 3/2. Like, there's a very good chance he has those cards. Right? Or like a 3/5 or whatever, right? There's a pretty good chance he has those cards and can play it. Whereas on the other hand, if you play reactively, you can always put the 4/3 down when your opponent has like a really big minion. In which case, this actually just deals 4 damage to the appropriate target.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So that's my spiel about end of game situations and when to hold the card. And of course, the whole like premise of this is that you don't need to put pressure on his face, because whatever you put down, then will have a chance to go face for X amount of damage unless he taunts. So if that's important to you, you just put it down, right? That's an overriding factor.
Right. I'm trying to think of something to add, but I think you've explained it pretty well. And sort of, man, I just know that like some people will be like, well, this is obvious. Like it's just about valuation, right? Like I'm just sort of doing the risk assessment and evaluation that I always
I would
do.
say 75% of the time, people I watch make this mistake. Like when
Yes.
the scenario comes up, they more often than not make the wrong choice, which almost never happens, by the way. Anything we like have taught you up to this point, like people are still usually making the right choices. They're just not consistent about it.
Right.
Right.
I think this topic is something very easily that people can look at and hear. And I'll say this: look, if you're already in like a 7-win average above player, like this comes easily to you, probably. Like you listen to this and you're like, oh yeah, of course, like it's in my wheelhouse of options, right? But for a lot of people that I coach, it's very tough for them to think about like not doing anything. So like if there's one big takeaway, it's like open your mind up to the possibility of doing not just less, but like nothing.
Absolutely nothing,
right?
especially in late game situations in which card advantage is important.
Right. Because like this has come up quite a few times, and people have a fear of like not doing anything. They're like, oh well, like playing stuff is always better, right? Like they have this
Use your mana.
mindset.
Use all your mana. Very basic.
Use all your mana, or it's just like, well, like I should play anyways. Initiative is good, and most of the time it is good. And this is why sort of like with beginners, you can give them sweeping statements like trading is really good, right?
Yeah. Don't leave your opponents with stuff on the board so they can spike or steal it.
Yeah. It's like when in doubt, trade, right? It's like if you're and in the beginning, like if you're 3-4 wins, you should like over trading is better than over facing, over smorking, right?
Yeah.
But this is like Advocate said before, this is one of those things where as you get more advanced, like embrace the power of nothingness.
Yes.
And use your sort of innate calculations and reads and put them to good effect, and get rid of the doubt that creeps into your mind and the fear, because it is kind of scary to not do nothing. I don't like it either. Like it's not. I consider myself kind of a tempo-oriented player, so I don't like it. But it is
tempo
correct.
gives you choices, right? Like assuming you don't have like initiative in your hand, tempo is what gives you initiative the next turn to do things. If you don't have stuff on the board, you don't get to make the choice of what to attack and where to attack. And so your impact on the game is less. Your opponent's decision-making impact on the game is more. If you're a good player, you never want to do that. That's like always a bad situation. So it's a very bad thing to do as a general matter. But sometimes it's the correct move because the advantages outweigh the fact that you can't, like, you don't have initiative the next turn. And it's all a game of odds, right? It's a game of what percent chance your opponent has this, what your reads are, and all that. So the odds do sometimes tilt in favor of you just doing nothing. Just don't be afraid of that. And I think the most frequently this happens in an actual game is like Mage v Mage battles, and then it starts stalling. Like, what happens if you play a 3-2? Well, in your opponent's turn, he pings your 3-2, does nothing, then you do a bunch of stuff, then he pings the 3-2 again and drops his stuff. Well, all of a sudden you're down a card. You're down 3 damage on him, right?
Right.
Like, that's
sometimes
huge.
You're okay with that.
Yeah, sometimes if you're putting pressure on his face, that's totally okay. If you're like, yeah, I'll get 3 damage on his face, and I'll get to set up a bigger board the next turn without fear, right? Or, oh, I have something else to ping, right? Like a Scarlet Crusader that I wanted to drop anyway, right? This is great. But if you're just in a pure card advantage battle, it's what loses you the game if you like put the 2-3 out too early.
Yep.
And also, the other thing, like you're connecting the two examples with the 6-6 eating the 3-5 and the empty board, whether you put a 2-3 out or not in the end of the game. If you're trying to put like a 4-3 out or like a 2-3 out into your opponent's thing, and then you're pretty sure the next turn you can flip the board so that you can put it out so that it would have initiative, always save it. Like, that's like such a big swing, right? The difference between having when it comes, as long as you're not about to die, right? The difference between having something on the board that can get initiative the next turn and having something that's guaranteed to not get initiative the next turn is pretty big. Because again, what you're trying to do as a good player is to get initiative. And your minions get initiative the next turn, assuming it doesn't get removed. So if you have the choice between this turn, if I play it, it will never get initiative. Next turn, if I play it, it probably will, because I have a way to flip the board the next turn. That's a pretty big good sign that you don't want to play it right now. And again, the thing that we set aside at the very beginning about Arcane Intellect and other ways of gaining resources creeps back in as an additional layer on top of this, because much more frequently, you're not going to be deciding between doing nothing and doing something. You're going to be deciding between doing nothing tempo-wise and doing more things tempo-wise, but not good things tempo-wise, right? And instead to get these other resources. And they all chip away at this analysis. So like I said, right, if you're doing nothing, like more than on average once every game, you're definitely doing it wrong. Like you shouldn't even do nothing once every game on average. It's something that happens like a couple times during the run as the right choice, and then you win the game because of it, and you're like, yeah, that's wonderful. But no. And if you're a class like the Hunter or something, that may never be the right choice.
Yes. It's so, yeah, I'm thinking about Hunters, and it is almost never correct to do that.
I mean, sometimes you have like, I don't know, like a 7 mana card and you have 8 mana and you're like, do I hero power or play the 7 mana card? And you're like, yeah, I need to hero power and pass because I need the 2 damage on his face. But those are the only scenarios as Hunter in which you would just like do nothing. Because that doing nothing, because that like putting the 7 mana card on the board, like that has a cost, right? That means you lose 2 damage to your opponent's face. That's not costless. Right. In these situations, we're saying it's basically costless. All right. I mean, it's not costless. The cost is how efficiently you've used your card as a resource, but it's otherwise costless. Okay, so that was the control version of, like, last time we went with aggro in Ungoro. This is like the control method in Ungoro, right? The scenarios where if you're a mid-range or control deck that you will face, in which going extra control will help you win the game.
Squeezing out those, like, that value / resource by doing nothing.
I like to think of it as just like not wasting a resource, because you're just feeding your opponent's minions by putting stuff out on the board, right? It goes back to So okay, so to sum this up, the 2 reasons you would want to detempo like really heavily and do actually nothing with your mana, even if you have nothing else better to do, is 1, if you have a lot of the board and you want to avoid a board clear, or 2, the opposite, you are about to totally lose the board to your opponent, you don't want to feed your opponent stuff. So in the first case, there's a caveat that sometimes you don't win the game if he has a board clear anyway, in which case you want to push. And the caveat in the second part is you need to watch your health and your opponent's health. Right? If your opponent has low health, you want to pressure. If you have low health, you want to pressure so you don't die. So those are some of the caveats, and then there's a whole layer on top of that about what happens if you do have ways to spend mana to gain other resources, such as Arcane Intellect and whatever, and how the trade-offs are to tempo based on that. But that's way more advanced, way more situational. Okay, so that's deep fried meta. When to hold. Do we have a question from the GOAT?
Yes, we do. So question from the GOAT is from one of our Twitter followers. Let me just pull it up. Question from the GOAT is from Cold Run on Twitter. Thank you so much. He asks, as a newer Arena player, should I just focus on the good classes, or should I actively practice Warrior, Lock, etc. also? So I think this is a fairly common question, right, that people ask. It's like, well, if I'm just starting off, what should I do, right? And I guess my advice is, if you had a magical way to, for example, pick Mage every single time, right? But you can't, and a lot of people are just like, oh, well, you should play just the good classes, right? And I think that's fine, but when you don't get like just the good classes, I think you should play around a certain theme. So for example, what are 2 really good classes right now? Rogue and Mage. And then if you can't get those, play another ping class. Like Druid is not great, but sort of get used to having a ping, right? Like play with that ping in mind, because the having a ping versus not having a ping as a class, it's like it's so huge. It changes the way you turn plan and everything. So obviously pick the good classes, but when you can't pick the good classes, try to strengthen your play of those classes by picking a class that has some similarities to it.
Yep. That's a really good advice. And I know like Druid win rates are like one of the worst in the game, but then you've heard us say it so many times here. Like the good players are all pretty good with Druid, like compared to their other classes, because you always have initiative. It's crazy how much good players can do with initiative, right? And the thing with the ping is that it is the only thing that makes sure you always have initiative. Every single turn, you have a chance to have initiative. And that just makes a really big difference. As on the flip side, if let's say you already play those classes pretty well and you want to focus on something else, then you want to focus on those classes. Like I would say it's a really bad idea to play all 9 classes evenly off the bat. Just like a really horrible idea. You want to specialize in a class or two and pick them whenever they come up. And then you want to slowly broaden your range, right? Like Warrior is actually one of the last classes. I think it was the last class that I started playing because it was like so bad. No, Warlock was the last class I started playing. Warlock, Hunter, and then Hunter and Warrior I played the same time. And it turned out to be my favorite class, until Blizzard destroyed it a number of times, repeatedly. But it was never the best class, but it was really good with my playstyle, and I liked the options and the pressure and the choices I had to make as a Warrior player. But I would still not recommend anyone start with a class like that. Like I like the fact that I started as a Mage and Druid player. Those were my 2 like early classes that I would pick all the time. Anytime I got it, it was Mage and Druid. Rogue was even a little iffy because Rogue is actually really high skilled, and you feel it, I think, as a new player, where sometimes you're like, oh my god, this class is so powerful. Other times you're like, what could I have done? And the answer is there's probably a lot you could have done, but you just weren't doing them because it was just a really hard class, especially in turns 1 through 3. But Mage and Druid, I think, are really good, like, starter kind of classes. And on the flip side, Paladin is a very good starter class. I don't think you learn as much playing Paladin, but it's certainly good for your win rate. And it opens up another style, which used to have a partner in Shaman, but not so much anymore. So now it's just like Priest, sort of. So it's just Paladin and Priest, with Paladin being much better, and Priest being much more like RNG. Based on whether your minions stick or not. So those are what I would go for. I would avoid Warlock. That's such a weird class. I would avoid Warrior, not because it's just like really bad, but also because it's a very weird class. Hunter's actually good, but I would avoid that too because it's very different. Like those are classes that you start adding, and I would go with Hunter first, and then like Warlock / Priest to like add different dimensions to your game. Like, when you start understanding the game better, you want to focus on what it is the interactions with your face is and the interactions with, possible healing. And that's when you start, and the interactions with, like, unlimited card advantage, which, again, cost their life, right? Like, Hunter, Priest, somewhat Warrior, but really Hunter, Priest, and Warlock are the classes to bring in when you have enough of an understanding of tempo that you want to actively bring in the face considerations to the forefront of your game. Because that's what those 3 classes do.
Yep. Makes a lot of sense. But for those of you entering the arena, good luck. It's a tough time to sort of be playing. But once again, like we said at the very beginning, it is a very stable time.
Very stable.
It's good to sort of track your results and get a fairly accurate representation.
Yep. So let's move on to, we're going to play Mage today for class talk. But before we delve deep into the Mage and how amazing Mage is going to be in the next expansion and how it's still really damn good right now, let's talk about card good bad, which is Molten Reflection.
Yeah,
Molten Reflection is the card good bad today.
So what is Molten Reflection, Advocta?
Molten Reflection is a 4-mana card that says create a copy of one of your friendly minions. That includes the health, the current health, the current attack, and any text that this minion has.
Any states that it has.
Any states that it has too.
Remember as a Warlock, I Corrupting Misted all my opponent's stuff, and he chose to
that's so
Reflection his Ancient of Blossoms that has the mist on it, much to his regret.
Yes, don't do that because it
Yeah,
will die.
yeah. This is not like Faceless Shambler, which just
Mm,
copies stats, right? Like
yep.
that just copies stats. This just copies everything on the minion, which is great if it has buffs. Not so great if it's about to die
Hmm.
immediately. But I think this is interesting because we don't have it ranked very high, and I know some people quite like this card, right? And you definitely see the potential that it has once you are on later turns, and you put stuff down. If something sticks around, um, you can get quite a good sort of tempo swing, or you
Yeah.
can just get
Or
another quality minion.
yeah, or if it's like late enough, like if it's 10 mana or above, and you have a 6 mana card, you just get another 6 mana card for 4 mana.
Sure.
It's
Who
pretty
doesn't want
good.
two Border Fist Ogres on a turn,
Yeah,
right?
right. Like that's a 2 mana swing, right? Um, so why is it rated only at 83? 83 is really low. 83 is like in the range of please don't touch this card, like unless you absolutely have to. And the reason it's this low is because your chances of getting a minion as a whole minion back on the next turn is actually really damn low. Like, if your opponent uses a board clear, it hurts the minion. If your opponent has any like random damage effects, it hurts the minion. Your opponent could decide to throw a minion that's about to be pinged, or to prevent board clears or whatever, and just throw a minion into your minion inefficiently, right? He can like preemptively hit and freeze your minion. If he has anything on the board, he'll probably just remove that minion outright. So I'm not saying you can't just wait until you have a good target, but if you think of good targets for this as anything 6 mana or above, because if it's a 5 mana target, then really all that's happening is you have a 4 mana card that cannot be used as a 4 drop, and you only gain 1 mana of tempo and a card advantage out of it way later on. And it's a situational card. Like, that's just such an awful card, right? Like, if Molten
Right.
Reflection had a limit of 5 mana's worth of opponent, it's just like an almost unplayable card. So at around 6 mana, you start getting like some kind of value, and of course you can get higher value than that. And the chances, like how many 6+ mana minions or minions worth 6+ mana are you going to have in the course of a deck, right? Like maybe like 5. Like I think that's a
Max like
good number.
8.
Max
Like
8
if
if
you're
you're like
playing
a very card heavy deck.
right, right.
But and that's the other thing, right? If you actually have all those big minions, you know what you don't have?
Initiative.
Yeah.
Or like
And if you
yeah.
don't have initiative and all the other stuff because you're stacking your deck with like a curb and then big minions, then you're not going to have the board most likely, and you're not going to be able to Molten Reflection or anything even more, right? So for the decks in which you can actually get a large minion to stick on the board, you actually have less large minions because you have a more flexible deck. It just works in a really awkward way with how you need to structure your deck. And okay, so let's say you have like 5, which is kind of average. You're probably gonna have actually less than 5, like actual 6 mana plus minions. You're gonna draw like, let's say, 3 of them over the course of the game, and your opponents are going to have like on average like 1 to 2 hard removals saved for those minions. So they only realistically have to be able to remove your minion using the board or like a combination of ways to damage it, like once or twice, and then you're out. And then your Molten Reflection is not getting any value. Like, think about how often that happens. That your Molten Reflection is just not going to get value, period. It's a huge percentage of times. And the cost of it not being a 4 drop is so insane, because now this is in your deck as a late game card, right? And what does it do in the late game? Does it give you a big minion? Probably not. Instead, this late game highly situational card is probably going to give you a couple of mana's worth of tempo. That's what it's going
Right.
to end up giving you
And then it's like how important is that tempo,
in the
right?
late game when you have so much
Right, in the
mana.
late game. And it's like on turn 10, 2 extra mana worth of tempo is pretty negligible.
Mm-hmm.
On turn 2, like 1 extra tempo is game winning. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is just how things are.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then like, some percentage of time, like I think the mass majority of the time, you're going to Molten Reflection something that's worth around 4 mana later on. And you're gonna be like, alright, that wasn't that bad. But it was. Because who knows how long that card's been in your hand. Dead cards in your hand have a huge cost. When in this game you usually only have 3 or 4 cards in your hand. It reduces your options, and when you don't have options, you can't be a good player. So that's Molten Reflection. And that's why it's a crappy card. especially in Mage. Like, what mages have like a ridiculous amount of big minions? You have a bunch of Firelands portals, which only give you a 5 mana minion, so they're not even big. And then you
Yeah.
have like what are the big minions Mage would have?
No, you're hoping for like a card like Sated Threshodon, which is really annoying for your opponent,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So they typically ignore it.
Yep.
And then look, Molten Reflection on a Sated Threshodon, that's awesome, right? That's great.
Mhm.
So you're hoping for something like that. But our tier list severely penalizes unplayability,
Yep.
right? Like cost and unplayability. So it's not just about how expensive it is. It's sort of about, well, can you play it on the turn
That you
right?
want to play it.
Or when can you play it? And all like when you look at all of the factors, the fact that if you play it on turn 4, you are guaranteed to get anti-value, right? Or anti-tempo.
Yep.
And anti-value, basically.
You're guaranteed to not get a drop on turn 4. It's just something playable that will slowly lose you the board.
Yeah. And then later on, it's sort of like, well, when can you play it, right? I guess maybe like turn 6 after you've played like a 5 and they don't hit into it, but then they don't. And then you have to calculate like the percent chance that they don't.
And again, if you play it on a 5-drop, it's not that good.
No. And also, like if you play a taunt and you're hoping to copy the taunt, you have to hope that it's a board state in which they do nothing, right? Like they don't bump into the taunt and kill it.
Yep.
So yeah, you get into all these situations, and Molten Reflection has worked at times.
Yeah, oh yeah,
it definitely has. But
it's not like I've never drafted the card. I've drafted it quite a number of times because mages have a lot of really bad cards. So sometimes you're just offered stuff, and sometimes you have a deck that's good for Molten Reflections, right? Like, it's about the number of large minis you have. Sometimes you just have that deck in which you were not offered a lot of like good, flexible, small stuff, and or like other large stuff, and you just actually have a bunch of large minions, and you're like, all right, well, one of these is gonna stick around, or I lose anyway, right? Like, if my opponent removes all my big minions, and I have a deck that's like the win condition is basically big minion, well, this is a pretty good card because it makes your win condition win more, and if you didn't have your win condition to begin with, you lose anyway, right? Like,
yep.
But so, those are not the normal decks. Those are like the minority decks. So this is actually like it's a synergy card, right? Then you know exactly what it synergizes with.
All right, I think that's a pretty good summary of Molten Reflection.
Yeah. So let's talk about Mage. How good is Mage right now? We have it ranked as the 2nd best class.
Yeah. Look, Mage is pretty freaking good. You can make a good argument that it's the #1 class even. And I've been, our good friend Shady Bunny, who I know is going for the leaderboard this month, I know he's been killing it with Mage, right? And when he inevitably gets his like top 5 or maybe even like top 1 finish, I hope I'm not jinxing him. So, Shady, if you're out there, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jinx you. I know like after 20 runs, he has like a 8.8 average or something.
Damn.
Yeah, he's been killing it. But I know that he has been doing extremely well with Mage, and he's been picking it a lot, right? I think I was watching a stream, and he had a choice between Rogue and Mage, and he actively picked Mage.
That's bold.
Look, that's not really a stretch, right?
It's not that big of a stretch.
No, that's not a stretch at all. Like even if you think Rogue is #1, there's no way you can argue it's like, oh, but Mage is like a distant #2. And you can certainly argue Mage over Rogue. But Mage, why is it powerful? A lot of the reasons that it's historically been powerful. Very flexible hero power that scales well or / even better into the late game, right? Differentiating it from Druid, in which later on in the game, that 1 armor really doesn't counteract the fact that you're taking like 6 damage to the face, right? Whenever you hit something. The increase in spells has been fantastic. Elemental package continues to be very good for mages. And because of the cards that they've been given in this expansion, neutral and class, they have decent, I'm not saying they're great, like, fantastic at combating aggro, but they have decent, like, pretty good tools for combating aggro, right? Sort of like Flame Geyser not only deals 2 damage, it puts out a 1/2, which is really useful for
it doesn't put out a 1/2.
It gives you a 1/2. Yeah, that's what I meant. Like it gives you a 1/2, and just small stuff and extra hits out there to even out your damage. And 1/2 stat line is really good when you're combating aggro, especially Hunter. right, which has like 1/1s all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then with sort of the introduction of Tar Creeper, right, like it really has helped out Mage. And then you close out the game with your annoying Firelands portals and your meteors. So Mage is in a really good spot.
Yep. I mean, I agree, and it's a hero power, right? Like you have 1 damage, 1 ping, and it favors a control meta, and we are in a control meta. It's not bad in an aggro meta, so it's just the way the class is designed, right? It's just never going to be bad in arena unless you give it total trash cards, and it doesn't have total trash cards. It has meteor, it has an elemental package, which it has primordial glyph. Like it has okay to good cards for Angoro. There's the Steam Surgers. You're very top heavy in terms of your power cards because Steam Surger is a lot of card advantage, assuming you get it to trigger. Your Meteor is obviously a lot of card advantage. Your Primordial Glyph, you can pick which card it is, so that those are like all Discover cards are a good amount of card advantage. The Mage's Jade like extra card is the potion guy that gives you an extra card. Like there's just so much card advantage built into the Mage, and then there's so much like board clears and removals built into the Mage that it's just going to survive anything. And there's also enough in the Mage to have a curve too. Like it's just the way the arena is, not even like just in terms of the meta, which is favorable to the Mage because it's more control and answer and response, but even in addition to that, just their offering package of like everything possible is good. That doesn't mean they don't have a lot of bad cards, right? Like I think what gets overblown a lot, like one of the biggest weaknesses of Mage are all the secrets. Like secrets are bad. Everyone picks secrets, but they're not good cards. They're kind of made up for by a bunch of other cards that are really good. And when you have Arcanologists, you have to take secrets. But that kind of just balances out how otherwise ridiculously OP Arcanologist would be, right? Like, it's 2/3 draw a card. Like, that's a ridiculous card otherwise. So, I would advise you guys, like, we rate all the secrets pretty low. What's our highest secret? Our highest secret is a counter spell at a 94, right? And after that's a mirror entity at an 86. Like
Counterspell is pretty good in this meta.
Yeah, Counterspell is great in this meta. But it's still one of those things. It's like not really an on-curve card on 3. You play it in a bit later. It eventually counters a spell, which is more annoying to your opponent than that you're actually going to get value out of it, right? And mostly these secrets are just kind of there for when you get an Arcanologist, right? You would never take Counterspell as an average card because think of what it does. It counters your opponent's spell and they get to decide which one, right? It's not going to be that great. But if you get it for free, like let's say half the time because you have an Arcanologist and a counterspell in your deck, well then it's pretty damn good as a free card in your hand.
Yeah.
So the secret package is something you want to watch out for. Like I wouldn't go with a whole bunch of secrets before I get an Arcanologist unless my other choices are crap. Especially because mages have so many other ways to win. Like, you don't want to be spread too thin, needing to pick secrets and elementals and big cards and a curve. Like, there's too many directions you get pulled in with a mage because it's just so good in any of the directions. But you can't, like, go in all of the directions. That's, like, the biggest danger with mage.
Yep. All right. So we'll be playing Mage, which is a class that we really need to play because...
the great mage drought of 2016.
Oh my gosh, never forget.
If you guys don't know what the Arena Coupe is, we've been doing this for like 3 years now. It's just one run a weekend, and it happens after the Lightforge, and we play all classes evenly based on whatever class we played least. And for literally, like, I think it was like 48 or something. No, not 48. Maybe like 43 runs in a row, we were not offered Mage by Blizzard.
So
like,
astronomical.
It's 1/3 chance to be offered Mage every time. We just
so
rolled low on the 1/3 like 43 times in a row.
Lucky. And it spanned all of Karazhan.
Yeah, it spanned the entirety of Karazhan with the OP Mage. It was very sad.
Oh gosh.
That's why our Arena Coupe average is a true average, right? Like it's true randomness. All classes evenly.
So sad.
No.
Anyways, that's pretty good.
What is our Arena Coupe average now anyway? You want to look it up?
It's like 7.2.
It's 7.2 again. Oh, we're at 7.5 like before Angoro.
No, it wasn't. It's been a while since it's been 7.5.
No, 7.5. I still have it on the like Twitch page at 7.5 because it was
Oh,
7.5
yeah, we're liars.
when I
We're
last
liars.
updated it.
No, we're liars. We're big fat liars.
But I last updated it right before Angoro, so I know that right before Angoro in like 7.1, we were like we had it at 7.5.
Oh no, we're big fat liars. No, it's like 7.2. Still fine.
Okay, fine. So it's 7.2 now. So we had a huge drop in Angoro. We did get like a 12 win and an 11 win almost back to back actually, right? Like recently.
Yeah, and then 10.
And then 10, right?
But it just goes to show how bad the other runs were. All right. Anyways, hopefully we'll do well today. We got Mage, a very good and also very consistent class.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right, that's it for this week. See you guys next week. Also, a question from the GOAT will from now on be almost exclusively from the listeners. So if you have a question, tweet at me, tweet at Merps. Actually, tweet at Merps, don't tweet at me. It's Merps4248.
Yeah. Tweet at Merps4248 and give me your question.
Yeah, or email it to grinninggoatgaming@gmail.com or post it in our subreddit, which is the Grinning Goat subreddit. Any of those, we all check, we all see. We'll also look at the YouTube comments, but that's a less likely way to get it because I don't know if Merps looks at the YouTube comments for the Lightforge podcast. And it may also get lost in all the other comments. But yeah, that's it from us. Yeah, see you guys. One more thing, I just wanted to plug. I wanted to plug our YouTube channel because it's been losing a bit of traffic. And if you guys know anything about YouTubers, the adpocalypse of earlier in the year. It doesn't drastically affect us because we're pretty family friendly, but it's still not good for us. So we're hoping to get some more viewers. If you want to tell your friend about the Lightforge, even if they're not a big podcast listener, if they play the arena, maybe they'll watch our YouTube channel. All this is up on YouTube with our faces, and so you can look at us too if you want, and all my boxes behind me. And more importantly, if you are watching this on YouTube, you can like it. That helps. You can post a comment. That helps, and we will be more active in responding to your comments, which I know we've kind of like been less active in 2017 than we were before this. So that's a little plug for our YouTube channel. It also has a lot of other great content besides the Lightforge, like the Arena Coup that we keep talking about. That's on the YouTube. Every 12-win run we get, those are all going on the YouTube edited, so it cuts out all the downtime. And there's Goats Gone Wild, which is bi-weekly, like our highlight clips from the stream that are not, sometimes they're great plays, sometimes they're just us like screwing around or whatever, but those are always very interesting. And Match of the Week is a new addition we've had into our YouTube channel like a couple months ago, and that's like an educational run that we pick out every week. It's exciting. It's a game. It's just one game. It's very short. It's well edited. And it basically is something like, well, we didn't get 12 wins this run, and it's not on the Arena Coup, but we want people to see this game because this was a really interesting game for learning or for discussion, or maybe we made a big misplay, or maybe we questionably made a misplay, and we don't really know if we did make a misplay, and it's a good room to like discuss with people. And you can see how we think through, like, you know, all those games that you don't see on the 12-win runs, right? Because we always get this thing. We're like, oh, you guys only put your 12-win runs up. And we're like, yeah, I mean, I don't want to put my 03 runs up. But yeah, the Arena Coup is for like literally the most raw data that you can get, right? That's the Arena Coup. But for the other interesting things, we do Match of the Week now. Okay, so that's our YouTube. It's a plug for our YouTube. It's youtube.com/grinninggoat or /oddwookta. They both work because everything used to be, if you're a new listener, everything used to be under my name, and then we've migrated it all to the goat. But my name still works for the YouTube. Yeah, that's a really long plug for our YouTube channel.
Cool story, Bob.
Thanks.
Anyways, thanks for listening this week. This is Merps.
Oh wow, that's so weird. I don't know if I can deal with this misordering.
Goodbye. Have a great week.
This is Advicta. See you next week. All right, we're done. That really threw me for a loop when you ended it.
I know. It's crazy.